Hello, respected viewers. Hello, it's George from Ireland. So, welcome back to the channel once again. And by the way, I'll just show you I'm not a Chelsea fan. I'll just wear anything because this is what I'm doing, trying to keep heating costs down in a cost of living crisis. But turning my mind to the Russo-Ukrainian conflict, so we're now in what is it, the 24th month of it. So the second anniversary of the war's commencement is rapidly approaching, and they both ground that through quite a few troops. There was a United States estimate, I think it was in November last year, that Russia sustained something like 310,000 casualties all told, probably only about a quarter of those killed. So majority of them wounded, which could be anything from quadriplegic to something very minor, and could be back fighting in days. And Ukraine suffered about half those losses. But bear in mind that Russia's population is nigh on 4 times that of Ukraine. Russia can afford to sustain these losses, which Ukraine can't. On the other hand, this is a war of survival for Ukraine, whereas for Russia it's very much a war of discretion, much though Putin tries to present otherwise. Because if this really is a war of survival for Putin, why are you holding back? Why don't you draft every young man, not 1 in 10 young men? Why do you completely gear the economy towards that? Because the bargains we make with the Russian public is the so-called special military operation shall continue, but it's not going to impact ordinary life. You can still go around enjoying yourselves to the cinema, theatre, to parties, nightclubs, to sports matches and things like that. You can still go on holiday abroad and try and keep living standards as high as possible. And the government, yes, having to cut back on some areas like education because they raised the defence budget this year by something like 60%. But they don't want to cut other budgets too much because the war will become then too unpopular. An opinion poll late last year showed the majority of Russians actually want to end the war by negotiation. Obviously, they're hardcore pro-war people, which about 20% would say like no negotiation. There's a hardcore anti-war people who would be slightly higher than that, maybe 25%. But anyway, but Ukraine, because it's a free country, there's more a debate. The war weariness is setting in, and people are asking, can Ukraine really afford to go on paying this sort of price for virtually no gain, to gain so little in the counteroffensive? So a draft is coming. Obviously, at the beginning of the war, the Ukrainian military was inundated with people volunteering. There's no longer such an influx, barely a trickle, because here we are in 2024, and there is no sign that the war is going to end anytime soon. And Ukraine has suffered tens of thousands of military deaths. So very few men are volunteering, and obviously only a few women are volunteering. So it's obviously dispiriting for them that the counteroffensive was defeated. And the other thing about Russia is they can recruit not just from Russia. Some of the foreign students or guest workers there have fought and died. A Zambian guy was killed there. Some of the guest workers from Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, these Gastarbeiter are sometimes volunteering, sometimes they're duped, told they're going to be working in reconstruction of the cities that Russia's destroyed and taken in eastern Ukraine, and they find themselves pressed into military service. So that's working for the people from Belarus or Serbia volunteering in small numbers. Ukraine's got its International Legion for the Territorial Defense of Ukraine, and they were suggesting there are tens of thousands of fighters in that. It's something like only 2,000, and they'll only accept people who've got military or medical experience, so that they're quite fussy. So there are not many internationalists who are putting themselves forward. But if push comes to shove, Russia could recruit more proactively from some of these poverty-stricken Central Asian countries that are former Soviet republics. They banned it, and they've even performatively imprisoned people in Tajikistan who fought for Russia and come home. But the Tajiks, the regime might try to turn Nelson's eye to that, give a nod and wink to Putin. Yes, you can do it. Just try not to make it too obvious. Maybe even recruit here, and we'll just say you're going to work in construction in Russia, something like that. I've got no evidence that's happened, but that could happen, partly if there's secondary sanctions on these Central Asian countries, because the sanctions of Russia are failing. Russia is evading them quite successfully by buying things from third countries like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkey, the UAE, wherever. But some of these countries are very susceptible to secondary sanctions, like Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, which are quite poverty-stricken. But that actually might drive them more into Putin's arms, and just see as the only way to keep earning would be to have these remittances from men who are fighting for the Russian army. So there's patriotic spirit is dropping. Anyway, the Ukrainian military says it needs 400,000 recruits this year. The Russians say the Ukrainians say they need 500,000 recruits. Russians need only 400,000. So Kiev said they've got to do this, because they got to replace losses. There's always been a depletion since the war began. Moreover, they want to give some of the troops on the front line a break to come home on leave. The men be entitled to 1 week a year. Some of them haven't had 1 week in 2 years. So that's obviously unacceptable. And so the relatives of men who've been serving on the front line saying, come on, our menfolk, they've got to have a chance to come home. So Ukraine is trying to increase recruitment by cutting the age of the draft from 27 to 25. You say, why not make it 18 like anywhere else? That's ridiculous. Another point is some boys went abroad at the beginning of the war age 16 or 17 and have since attained military age, and very few of them are coming back to fight. Their families don't allow them to come back to fight. And okay, I mean, I wouldn't either. Ukraine has got a long way to go to stop draft dodging. So on Christmas Day, the Ukrainian government put forward this mobilization bill to the Verkhovna Rada, that is their legislature. Now, why was it timed? It's rather suspicious. Is that because they want as few people to notice as possible? Though that might actually boomerang, because there's very little in the news cycle on Christmas Day, apart from that. So I go with maybe cock up more than conspiracy theory. And by the way, Ukraine's only just shifted its Christmas Day in 2022 to that date, used to celebrate alongside the Russians on the 7th of January. So President Zelensky did not allow his name to go forward in connection with this bill because he realizes that this is deeply unpopular. A lot of people have got exemptions from the draft in Ukraine, and sometimes on the basis of trifling disabilities, skin irritations or whatever, or missing one finger or something. And there's some people who've got an exemption, yes, who really are disabled or blind or permanently wheelchair bound or whatever, and they genuinely can't serve. And so we're going to re-examine these cases, and some of these people who've got unreasonable exemptions, they've got to have those taken away. But the rescission of these exemptions shan't be popular, well, with those losing them, but the general public might say, yeah, it's preposterous. Someone's able to avoid the draft for this ridiculous reason. Anyway, so the draft notices might be sent out digitally. Russia's been doing this for over a year, and then they've got to try and stop the draft dodgers using their bank cards or buying or selling property or anything like that to flush them out. Why hasn't this been done long ago? I mean, I know there was sort of chaos and panic which hit Ukraine when the war began, but here we are almost 2 years in, settling down for a long war. It's almost static at the front. It may well become a frozen conflict. One thing is munitions are going to be more important than ever, as it's not really looking like it's going to be a war of movement. So the government has asked the regional authorities to be more proactive in assisting them with the draft. It's a lot of buck passing. The regional government would like to blame the national government would like to blame them. The way Putin plays it in Russia is he puts these unpopular decisions on the local authorities. They're a lightning conductor. He doesn't want to take the unpopularity, or say, you have to achieve these results and it's up to you how you achieve them. But anyway, they got to take the blame. So they'll be scapegoated. So military-age men in Ukraine find it relatively easy to bribe to get medical certificates saying that they're incapable of discharging military duties permanently. You can get temporary ones because you've got to know from which you'll recover, and when you recover, you can be drafted. But given the corruptibility of the Ukrainian authorities, it's surprising this thing isn't even more widespread. And Ukraine has made strides on this. It's not as corrupt as Russia by the world, transparency rankings. And actually, corruption was one of the grounds given by the Putin regime for its illegal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, which is completely imbecilic because, as I say, Russia's even worse on that one. Russia would have to invade Russia if that's the case. Should the United States invade Russia because Russia is more corrupt than the USA? It's just nauseating and idiotic. So some guys have been paid douceur to the border guards to let them leave the country, and tens of thousands of others have crossed the border illegally through forests, swimming through rivers, some of them drowning in the effort to enter Romania and such countries. And obviously there's some military-age Ukrainian men who were abroad when the war broke out and have not returned home to fight for various reasons. But so European Union countries are not forcing them to come back. Germany said it will not arrest Ukrainian draft dodgers and send them back. Well, if you want Ukraine to win, you're going to have to do that. And I'm surprised that other Western countries which are sheltering Ukrainian refugees haven't said this. Some guys get their draft notices and they just go into hiding. They have a false ID card or whatever, hide out in the forest. That's not as bad as being killed. So the draft is unpopular because there's this distinct lack of transparency and the fact that the wealthy and those with connections can avoid it. So a lot of men believe that if they do volunteer or they get drafted, they'll fight in the war, and if they survive, they won't have their jobs restored to them as they're supposed to be restored to them by law, get the same job back at the same level of seniority, all the rest of it, that they shan't be disadvantaged by this. So this is all very problematic. Last year, Zelensky, he sacked several heads of regional recruitment because there were dogma accusations that they were soliciting bribes. The police sometimes arrest draft dodgers in Ukraine and sometimes film them being dragged into cars, and it's quite unpopular. But if you're going to fight, you've got to have recruits, and if not, people step forward. You're going to have to do this. War is seldom pretty. So Volodymyr Zelensky, he doesn't want to be tarred with the unpopularity of the mobilization bill. I remember there was supposed to be an election this May, but that has been postponed sine die because Ukraine is under martial law. They can't hold them under martial law. They could lift the martial law for this, I suppose. So he's been castigated for rating his own re-election as more important than Ukraine's national survival, because he doesn't have the guts to say, we're doing it. Unpopular, I don't care, we're doing it. If I lose the election, so be it. That's a small price to pay that Ukraine might live. So, I mean, there was maybe too much of a cult around Zelensky, and obviously I admire him enormously, but I recognize that he's not without his faults, and he is a little bit venal and vain. I mean, what would you expect from an actor and a comedian? So we shouldn't make this too much about one individual who could lose the election, who could die, whatever, who could resign. It's about 40 million people, the Ukrainian nation. Anyway, so there's this falling trust in the government, and Zelensky's approval rating is down. Not surprisingly, it was very high beginning of the war, like 80%, and so you've got to thank him for that. He actually made them survive the initial onslaught. So the government is sort of trying to palm this off on the military. Oh, they demand this mobilization, not us, really. Well, ultimately, it's a political decision because it's not a military dictatorship. So the military have to say, this is what we need. Are you going to do it? You're going to not. And the civilian government provide them with this, not provide them with this. Nevertheless, the top brass will serve the elected government as best they can. So, surprisingly, it was 2 days ago, there was this exchange of over 200 prisoners of war. I mean, it was like 220 Ukrainians for 238 Russians or something like that. There were a handful of Ukrainian civilians who returned as well. I'm not quite sure via Belarus, something like that. So this was the first exchange in about 5 months. And it was stunning this happened, bearing in mind there's been this intense bombardment that seems to have slowed down today, actually, partly because the Ruskies are just fairly low on missiles after firing over 500 over the last week. So because you think that there was so much acrimony because of the civilians killed in the last week, this wouldn't happen, but it went ahead. So the United Arab Emirates, they played honest broker on this one. Is Saudi Arabia and the UAE have often mediated between the two sides, and if they're peace talks, it may well be hosted by the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia. Turkey hosted in the very early days. So it's now thought that about 3,000 Ukrainians are captives in Russia, and about 800 Russian prisoners of war are held by the Ukrainians. And the Russians are supposedly for a few months being inveigling them or forcing Ukrainians to join the Russian army. A few of them who might be genuinely ideologically aligned that way, just happen to get drafted into the Ukrainian army or whatever. Other people doing it because they're forced, or maybe sheer opportunism. You don't want to be in a prisoner of war camp still being tortured. You get out, that won't happen. You might be fed slightly more. Maybe there's a chance to redefect, to surrender, or something like that. So so much of this is going to come down to numbers, and obviously the outlook is grim for this year, with the Ukrainians just not having the munitions they need. And yes, munitions production being ramped up in European NATO countries, but not by enough. And most of that keeping themselves. So we really ran down our stocks of shells and so on in 2022 and 2023, and we need them for ourselves. We can only give a little bit to Ukraine. And so that's why it looks like Russia's got the edge in munitions and indeed recruitment this year. Because that's Ukraine's target, 500,000. I don't think they're going to get anywhere near that, unfortunately. They've got exemptions for the fathers of over 3 children. Why? Well, partly to incentivize births, but the idea if he gets killed was very bad for his 3 children. Why not fathers of 2 children or 1 children? Well, we've got to have some soldiers, and then we just wouldn't have enough. They might have to increase that to fathers of 4 children or whatever. The moment they've excluded the possibility of drafting females, but they might have to change the tune on that one. All right. And by the way, they don't recognize being trans. Otherwise, more men would proclaim themselves to be trans, and then they would evade military service that way. Well, thank you so much for watching my channel. Make sure you subscribe on Patreon. and donate on PayPal, georgecallahan79@gmail.com. Bye.